As with all of the social groups we'll be discussing this week, stereotypes play a huge part of mainstream media depictions of minority groups in our country. Stereotypes being, again, a preconceived and oversimplified idea of the characteristics that typify a group of people or situation, etc. The influence of stereotypes is huge in our society, again, because if we have a lack of exposure to diversity, we tend to rely more heavily on stereotypes, especially those portrayed in the media. So these have a strong influence on guiding our judgments and our behaviors and how we interact with others in our society. The idea of stereotypes, though, is that they're an inherent function of human cognitive processing. So what that means is, if you think of your brain like a computer, we rely on stereotypes because it's a shortcut in our thinking. If we can reduce the amount of energy it takes to think about a certain subject, that's better for our brain, much like in the way of a computer. If it has processing shortcuts, it will move faster, right? It will open up programs faster. It will respond to your clicking of a mouse faster. Our brain works in much the same way. We rely on stereotypes so that we don't have to think too hard about any given topic. So one of the negative sides of the reliance on stereotypes is the role that media play. And so media are assumed to contribute to the construction and maintenance of stereotypes, as I've been saying throughout this entire video. When we have limited exposure to diversity, then we are more heavily reliant on media to fill in the gaps and educate us otherwise. But what other factors contribute to the construction of stereotypes? And that's where media don't have this large, overwhelming influence on people. They do marginally influence us, but our family, our peers, our opinion leaders, our political affiliation, our religious leaders, things like that, those have a strong influence on us as well. And so in addition to the media, we find that our peer influence groups have a strong influence on us, obviously. But the relationship between the two is what's stronger here. So we go and we seek out the media that confirm what our family's already telling us, or we've already bought into this idea. So again, the problem being, if we don't get outside of our bubble in our life and go and experience diversity and appreciate diversity, we're more likely to fall prey to believing the stereotypes that we see in the media as being accurate representations of those groups. Another concept that I briefly discussed in the analytical tools video is that of iconography. So these are visual images and symbols that we consume in our media behavior. Films use specific sets of visual and oral signs to connote stereotypical qualities. And they do this, again, if you can think back to last week's videos, they do this to set up narrative expectations. They do this to sometimes reinforce dominant ideologies in society, but they also do this because it's easier to tell the story. I think kind of lazy script writing, right? So if we use certain stereotypes or we abuse certain stereotypes and icons, it's really in the sense that they have become so pervasive in society that it's easy for people to pick up on them. So for example, when we see depictions of gay males in the media, historically that's been a specific representation. Now our media sphere is becoming much more complex and complicated, and that's a good thing, that we don't want to see one representation of any single group. But in the 1990s, if we were to look back at mainstream television and their depictions of gay male, it was usually a flamboyant gay male who has a lisp, who has a limp wrist, who is very effeminate, who might be very extravagant. So this stereotype, if that's our only interaction with that group, would be fairly detrimental and demeaning to that entire group. Even if it might be slightly applicable to some people within that group, the danger of believing a stereotype is it doesn't represent everyone all the time. And so we really have to cut down on our human nature of relying on stereotypes and that cognitive processing and really start to question the stereotypes that we're consuming and question if we believe in them or not. The last concept I want to discuss in this section is masculinity. So when we discussed feminist analysis last week, we talked a lot about the impact of media on the representation of women, but what we didn't talk about is the representation of men, which is becoming a much larger trend in academic research these days, but has been something that's been largely overlooked for much of the research on media portrayals of gender. So when we are defining masculinity in our society, we're typically associating masculinity with the idea of athletics or strength or physical prowess. We're associating it with economic success. So if we think historically, especially if we grew up in a two-parent household, the male was to provide for the family. The male needs to go out, get a college degree, get a good job, get a wife and have some kids, and provide for those people. He should be the central economic focal point of that unit. And lastly, the idea of sexual prowess. And we see this double standard all the time, which can be really frustrating for people, men and women alike, and everyone on the spectrum, that men should be out there sleeping with as many partners as possible. Women should not. Women should be pure and chaste and save themselves. We hear this dynamic all the time. We see this stereotype all the time in the media that if you are the young woman who is sexually active in a horror movie, you're going to be the one who's murdered. But if you are the boy or if you're the young man, you see movies like American Pie where the whole focus is on your virginity, and you better not be a virgin because then you're obviously not a man. We send these messages out to people. We send these messages out to our young people especially, and that unfortunately has such a pressure on the idea of what masculinity is, and much in the way that the way we represent women in our media has a negative effect on both men and women and everyone on the gender spectrum. The same goes for masculinity. That when young men have this pressure to be overtly masculine, that's not only bad for them, that's bad for everyone in our society. That's bad for if they're in a heterosexual relationship, that's bad for the young women they might be dating, if they turn towards aggressive, violent behavior because they're consuming all of this hyper-masculine media. And so when young men are learning masculinity, they do it through their peers, their role models, and more importantly, their media. So the movie you'll be watching this week, The Mask You Live In, addresses this phenomenon specifically. Because again, it's not a conversation we have too often. The impact of masculinity, the impact of hyper-masculinity in our society. And we see that media exacerbate the social construction through the reinforcement of the binary. That women should behave a certain way, men should behave a certain way, and there's really nobody in between those two binaries, right? You have to force yourself into one of those categories.